Welcome, everybody, to the AI for Information Accessibility satellite panel. We're coming to you from Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada. The topic of today's panel is what is responsible about responsible AI. I want to start by acknowledging that those of us who are here at the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledge that we're situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. This is actually an important part of the year for us because Monday is Truth and Reconciliation Day, and it's a day when we reflect on how reconciliation is going, what our role in it is, and so on. Now, as I mentioned, this is a satellite panel, and I just want to mention the full-blown conference. This is, if you will, the appetizer, the delicacy that you have for tomorrow when we have the full Artificial Intelligence for Information Accessibility conference. The conference tomorrow is a 24-hour conference. That doesn't mean that you have to spend all 24 hours online, but it has been being organized on GatherTown. And I'm going to ask Nico to put the URL for where you can go and find out about the conference and where you can register. And you can basically join at any time of the day. GatherTown is like an 8-bit game experience where you can wander around and talk to people and watch different talks and stuff like that. As Nico said, today's presentation will be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, please, stay muted and so on. At this point, we're going to play the working group chair's video welcoming us, Cordell Green. So I'm going to hand it over to a virtual Cordell.
Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you warmly from Jamaica in your various capacities. We gather at a time when artificial intelligence joins the pantheon of great human inventions that permanently reshape society. The invention of painting, photography, film, etc., is about humans attempting to replicate ourselves and what we observe and experience. Generative artificial intelligence helps us to do the same. In that sense, it is like old wine in a new bottle, except that the scale and scope of its impact are unprecedented. Anyone can now make fake images, videos, and sound at the speed of thought, and so real that we default to positions of disbelief and distrust in what our eyes have seen and ears have heard. What does it portend for society when we question the truth of a palpable and visceral experience with our child, our child's teacher, our doctor, lawyer, or spouse, when critical information is received from emergency services, such as an immediate evacuation order, or a determinative statement made by a political aspirant on the eve of an election, or when there is breaking news from a trusted news source. If untruth and disbelief scale to a point where we normalize fiction, fraud, and distrust, society becomes dysfunctional and a mere carcass. Hence, exhortations such as that of the late Professor Stephen Hawking, that AI poses an existential threat to humanity. But a threat does not equate to an inevitable outcome. Neither is our choice a binary one of utopian AI hype or crippling AI dystopia. The more we all know about AI, the more we can actively shape its development and use it for the good of society. For this to happen, there must be openness, inclusivity, and enlightened access. People of all walks of life who will be or are being affected by AI should have a say about it. That is the purpose of today's discussion. It is one of 8 from around the world, culminating on September 28, when we meet on the GatherTown platform for the flagship AI for IA virtual conference with over 68 speakers. All of this information is being made available as part of our collective task to eliminate information asymmetry and write instead, hopefully, a story about human flourishing. Let me conclude by thanking members of the UNESCO IFAC Working Group on Information Accessibility, which I have the pleasure of chairing, the very small band of AI for IA conference organizers from India, Jamaica, UK, Canada, USA, Chile, Ukraine, Germany, China, South Africa, and Botswana, supported by the UNESCO IFAP Secretariat in Paris, the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa, the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean, the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica, University of Alberta in Canada, and the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. I also join in extending our gratitude to the local organizers and partners of today's satellite panel. See you on the GatherTown platform on Saturday, September 28. Thank you. Megan, big up on yourself.
Well, thank you, Cordell. My name is Jeffrey Rockwell. I'm going to be the moderator of today's event. I'm a professor of philosophy and digital humanities here at the University of Alberta. I'm also a Canada CFAR AI chair and a fellow of the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, which I would also like to thank because they have supported us along with support we're getting from colleagues here at the University of Alberta. Today's topic of responsible AI is one that interests me in particular for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is a keyword for the Canadian AI strategy. If you go to the central webpage of the Canadian government in which they talk about how they're going to use AI themselves, the title is Responsible Use of Artificial Intelligence in Government. Responsibility is also central to one of the major international initiatives supported by the Canadian government as part of the Pan-Canadian strategy. This is the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, or GPI, an initiative that was started by Canada and France and now includes over 20 countries and the EU. 2 of the 4 working groups set up by GPI are based in Montreal, and one of them has the title of Responsible AI. When I look at how the rhetoric of responsible AI is sort of leveraged, one of the things that stands out is that it is a call for both investment and risk management. The language, especially in the GPI, often talks about the opportunities, but then managing the risks. Finally, the last thing I'm going to say before introducing our panelists is that I like the word responsible because of its etymology. If we go back to the Latin for respondere, responsible comes from respond, answer to, promise in return. Responsibility, if you will, is a promise that we now have to live up to. So at this point, I want to introduce our panelists. And the order is really just the order that I copied their introductions. So it's not a particular order, but I'm going to start with Bettina Berendt, who holds a chair for Internet and Society at the Technical University of Berlin, Germany. She's also a director of the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin and a guest professor at KU Leuven in Belgium. Her research includes data science and critical data science, especially with respect to privacy and data protection, discrimination and fairness, as well as AI and ethics with a focus on textual and web-related data. Dr. Florence M. Chi is an associate professor of digital communication in the School of Communication and the director of the Center for Digital Ethics and Policy at Loyola University, Chicago. She is also the founding director of the Social and Interactive Media Lab, the SIM Lab, devoted to the in-depth study of social phenomena at the intersection of society and technology, and her book, Digital Game Culture in Korea, The Social at Play, 2023, Lexington Books, critiques commonly held notions of online game addiction by taking an ethnographic look at the social and cultural roles that games fulfill in everyday life. Tuba Yoldas is a PhD student candidate here in philosophy at the University of Alberta. Her doctoral dissertation focuses on artificial moral patiency and the ethics of AI. She specializes in the philosophy of mind and the ethics of AI with additional competencies in other areas, including the philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of language, and metaphysics. And finally, Katrina Ingram is the founder and CEO of Ethically Aligned AI, a company focused on helping organizations to drive better outcomes in the design, development, and deployment of AI systems. A seasoned executive, Katrina has over 2 decades of experience running both not-for-profit and corporate organizations in the technology and media sectors, as well as experience in the public sector. She was named to the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics list. She holds an undergrad in business administration from Simon Fraser, a Master of Arts in Communications and Technology from the University of Alberta, and is an IAPP certified information privacy professional. So I welcome our 4 speakers. What's going to happen now is I'm going to call on each of our speakers who are going to make a brief presentation. Some have slides, some don't. And then I am going to start moderating questions. I'm going to bring some questions that you who have registered. Some of you wrote questions when you registered, so I'm going to start with one of those questions. And then I'm also going to see what questions come from the floor, so to speak, or the screen. And we also have here, we're in a class on AI ethics, so I'm also going to draw on questions that come from the students that are here with me. So at this point, I'm going to start with Bettina. Would you be willing to start us off, Bettina? And I think you have slides, so now's a good time to pop them on and get started.
Okay, I can do that. I'm just gonna share my whole screen because I'm changing the applications. Right. You see a Chrome window with Responsible Artificial Intelligence book on it, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. So thank you so much, Jeffrey, for inviting me, and Cordell in absentia. And thank you everyone for having me at this panel. It's a great honor to be talking to you about responsible AI, and I'm so curious to hear your opinions. Because I have been struggling with this notion for a long time. And when I struggle with a notion, I try to walk through an example, and then more questions appear. And then when it goes well, I think this is so interesting that I can share it with other people. And I hope this is going to happen today, that you find it interesting. So I believe that the original author writing about or coining the term responsible artificial intelligence was Virginia Dignam. She has recently also published a book about that. And her point is that we don't only need to look at the ethics and understand understand decisions relating to AI with respect to ethical theories, but it's really important to act on that. And so that the responsibility or the execution of responsibility lies in doing the right thing, if you will. And this has been taken up by many actors, many industry proponents trying to set up principles for responsible AI, and also governments. So this is, I hope, the closest to the current discussion that I found regarding Canada. Guiding principles for the use of AI in government with regard. Sorry, here it is. Responsible use of artificial intelligence. It was the correct site. Wait. Man. Okay, and so there's a lot of principles here. And what we find very much, I'm going to start a little bit in the middle, is to say we hear a lot about impact assessments at the moment. And so, it seems the core problem seems to be all kinds of agencies, industry, governments, etc., are using AI systems without really knowing what they're doing. It just sounds cool to have this application that solves your immediate problems of trying to dole out money to people who request it, or running something more efficiently, etc. So very importantly, we should be looking at impact assessments done before the fact. So we should not only carry out impact assessments, but publish them as well. And also here in this case, they outline the importance of publishing source code, training data, independent audits, etc. So there's transparency as a key requirement. The idea is, if I want to be responsible, I have to be transparent. And if people understand what the AI is doing and why we're using it, then about half of our problems will already be solved. Then very often we also hear about explaining the automated decisions, or having a general explainability in the AI. There's a lot of talk about oversight mechanisms, and very often we hear about specific human rights principles. Privacy is to be protected, and where do we have the bias and the fairness? So sorry, I don't really see that at the here. And so there seems doing everything that we can upfront before we decide to use a system, to have these ethics by design put into the system and into our use of it. What I think is very interesting here is that they also say they want to promote openness about how, why, and when AI is used. Okay, so a lot of big plans here and a lot of noble goals. And it fits very well to a big system like the use of AI by government in the labor market, etc. But what about these little systems that are just everywhere and that people just start using? And I'm going to be looking at the examples of two systems that are very much related to the labor domain. And you'll see why. So this is DeepL, not the machine translation, but the rewriting service. And I apologize for the headlines here being in German, because somehow the AI wants to keep showing me the things in German. And what you can do is to take a text and choose the style of rewriting, which could be simple, business, academic, easygoing, or the tone, enthusiastic, friendly, sovereign, and diplomatic, and rewrite the text. And so, for example, I'm doing a business, and very much the idea is I'm not really able to express myself that well, maybe because I don't know English so well. So when I write a job application, I should better use a tool like this. And we've been developing ourselves also further CV writing tools that help you structure your CV and basically a completely different technically related application is this one, also in the labor context, where we looked at whistleblowing as one of the big problems where people, well, write reports and they denounce wrongdoing, but unwittingly tell too much about themselves. So what we've done is, here's a silly example text to develop a tool, and I need to show this in the slideshow, that takes the text and then analyzes that and says, well, you know, if you gave these details, when did you arrive, with what means of transport, what is the color of your water bottle, and so on, you may be giving away who you are, and you may not want to do this when you're reporting a wrongdoing. You may want to stay anonymous. So our tool can help you anonymize by kind of getting rid of these problematic indicators of your identity. And you see here, that would be, it's a little bit like the DeepL thing. It just writes a different text. Okay, so why is this a case for responsible AI? Okay, and what's the responsibility here? We're throwing this out on the market, and are we doing something useful for humanity? Are we doing responsible AI? So we could check, are we, where is the, here, the guiding principles. Are we fulfilling all these criteria? And we could say, yeah, sure. We make sure that okay, is this responsible? Then, yeah, nobody really worries too much about a tool that can be used in out of context, but it could, in some sense, say, well, why? Who needs it? Is it responsible to create tools that nobody needs? And I'm coming back to this first principle here. We not only don't want, we should not only promote openness about how, why, and when AI is used, but maybe say that nobody really needs that, but do that. So should we have an extra principle and saying a product should also promote some value? You know, so let's say an SDG, let's say it should really push the chances of disadvantaged people. It should really do something for increasing equality. And we could say in this case, yes, it would be helping people whose native language isn't English to express themselves better. Okay, so why could that even be a problem? And I thought, and I heard the reactions of two people, one in the context of applications and the other in the context of whistleblowing. The applications, so it was a colleague of mine saying, well, normally I get a signal from the language with which somebody is writing their application. I'm losing that signal. So what criteria should I go by? And this, of course, happens to all the HR departments. They get many more applications. It's much more difficult to differentiate between who's a good applicant, because the signal and the language isn't there anymore, assuming that there is some correlation. So what are they going to do? They're going to use more AI to filter all these applications. And they're going to either invite all these people over for test working, or watch their, or do it in a kind of less explicit way by an economy that expands even more into everybody has to show their work first for free on the internet, or going to delegate that to a surveillance system that looks for globally recognized documented qualifications, and that would have a lot of other problems as well, such as who is in charge of giving these certifications and so on. So it's kind of shifting the whole system of applications, and as soon as such a system exists, people will have to use it. Like companies will have to use an AI that exists in order to not be left behind. Individuals will have to use rewriting things in order to not be left behind. And what does this do with the whole system of applications? Whistleblowing, we had a similar comment by somebody running a whistleblower support headline. Well, we get so many wrong reports that are unwarranted, and we need the signal in the original voice of the person that expresses themselves in order to say whether this is a legitimate complaint. I'm not judging here. I think we had long discussions about that, whether that is a legitimate view or it's a legitimate view about whether we like this view or not. But again, signal is going missing. And so how should we proceed from that? We have something that pushes somebody's basic rights. It's a good system, so that seems like it's responsible, but it sets off a new dynamic, which in the end leads to just another equilibrium in a capitalist labor market. So is that responsible at why this AI is used? And how does this product change the world for the better? And so the question is, who decides that? What's the advantage of this arbitrage gain, if you will, in the short run versus developments in the longer run? How can we even involve all the stakeholders in such a discussion? How can we be inclusive about changing the whole system of how people express themselves, and what happens with language and the signals inherent in it, and what this does to the labor market? And so all of a sudden we have very different questions. We have questions of how to do inclusion, rather than just a couple of stakeholder workshops, and how to make the political decisions for whether we want to have AI in a certain domain. And I don't see these questions. I don't see the question of how and why AI is a fundamental question about politics. and how the decision to put some product on the market is a very political decision, because all I see here is, well, let's assume the product is there, and then we make it privacy preserving and bias free and so on and so forth. So I would like to put this up as a discussion point. And I think I took quite a bit of time. And I'm looking very much forward to what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. And I would like to now hand it over to Florence. Take it away.
All right, I'm hoping against hope that you see what I intend you to see, which is the PowerPoint presentation with the big orange thing and
Yeah.
nothing further. Because I have all sorts of windows, because I'm a media scholar turned ethicist in the last decade and a half or so. Hi, I'm Florence Chi. I'm a technocultural ethicist, which derives from my perspective, which is from media scholarship. I'm alum, PhD 2012 of Simon Fraser University. So I'm finding myself in between worlds. Of course, I am now based in the US, in Chicago, but my recent work has included global perspectives on the regulation of AI. And so fundamentally, looking at media and its datafication has turned me towards the ethical implications of how that data informs our current practices. And, this is to say that I'm often serving on teams as the technocultural ethicist because of this perspective in between worlds, where I ask computer scientists and lawmakers and business folks, do we really need that data? And a lot of our issues to do with AI and using AI responsibly has to do with issues that predate AI. And this is something that a lot of us, I think, are struggling with in terms of definitions, as Bettina kindly went into. And so I won't belabor them here. But fundamentally, we need to, as the OECD seeks to define AI as AI systems primarily. And so when we look at AI as a system, then we can more broadly encompass and include the multiple perspectives and stakeholders necessary in conducting ourselves responsibly. And so this quote here, which I'm getting into, is putting technology into the hands of people, which is the spirit of this UNESCO conference, making technology and information accessible. It isn't enough if the system is out of reach, right? So when we talk about more familiar initiatives back decades ago, one laptop per child, and the philanthropic objectives that we typically have of digital literacy. I'm an educator, so my first and foremost priority is educating all of us in any room and empowering others to educate their own loved ones and their networks about the various harms, because we are not in this alone. We are all networked, right? And so difference in terms of what we can do technologically versus what we should do ethically versus what we are beholden to absolutely by law are very distinct conversations that we need to bring together, and increasingly so given the multi-stakeholder nature of what we're doing. I belong to, as an external consultee, I served on the Freedom Online Coalition's Task Force for AI and Human Rights. And so this really drives home how responsible AI tends to ethics wash some of our noble endeavors to the point where, you know, if you're a company wanting to regulate yourself, it's quite easy to make the case that you've ticked all the elements on a checklist. There, I was responsible, and therefore I was ethical, and no harm was done. But this is where ethics is particularly suited to looking at harm and risk of harm from an existential point of view. So, you know, we've been having these meetings around the world. This was the last meeting, Task Force on AI and Human Rights, in Berlin this past December. And we got together and talked about things like feminist perspectives on social scoring, right? So you might be aware that the data that we are emitting every day goes into these massive databases, which are then used to teach machines about us, right? So teaching machines about us so they can be more intelligent. Predictive analytics was where we were, and now generative AI is where we are. And so now that we can fabricate actual people, places, it is a distortion of reality that we need to be mindful of. And I think this is what Bettina fundamentally touched upon with politics, right? Because we are in a definitely super election year, especially in the US, as many of you may be aware. So if we look at it from the point of view of data, fundamentally in training these foundation models, then we really need to have our ducks in a row when it comes to making sure that data has integrity. And if we do not, then we leave ourselves open to misinformation, and then we become complicit in disinformation, which is ultimately harmful. In this datafication, one last thing to wrap up is looking at human rights, right? Looking at privacy as a human right. It wasn't that long ago, but it seems like a long time ago, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his, that's already out of date, privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Already, these rights have been impinged upon. We assent to that every day. And so if we look to only what is permissible by law, we are permitting a lot in our everyday practice with respect to our data, our sovereignty, our autonomy, privacy, and human rights. So this is what I try to remind people of, what we should do and try to campaign for that. Okay. And, you know, we're in the process of looking at this intersection of the Constitution and human rights as it is in the US context with respect to the AI Bill of Rights that's built upon constitutional principles. And I'm part of this AI safety consortium, so looking at it in terms of AI safety. So without taking too much from the collective discussion time, which I know we need to leave some minutes for, I leave you with just a little plug for this coming spring for a Center for Digital Ethics and Policy annual consortium, annual symposium. So if you like what you're hearing today, Bettina and Jeffrey have been co-conspirators in conducting one of these for our 10th anniversary one. So it's nice to see you again, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Florence. I want to turn next to Tuba. And take it away, Tuba.
Thank you so much. You can still hear me, right?
Yep, yep.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Well, sorry about the small PowerPoint format. I can't make it a slideshow because my notes are on the other document and I have a very limited amount of time to say what I wanted to say. So first, I want to just start with, you can see the slides, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. First, I just want to say a couple of words about where I'm coming to this debate from. As Professor Rockwell already said, I'm working mainly on the nature of minds and the nature of future artificial minds. And so I'm not doing mainly AI ethics, but I started working on responsibility when I was teaching 2 courses last semester in fall. I was teaching, on the one hand, I was teaching knowledge and reality, so where I was teaching the nature of free will and moral responsibility. And on the other hand, I was teaching a course on ethics and AI, where I was talking about responsibility as meaningful human control, which I'm going to be talking about here today. So that's when I started getting interested in responsible AI, and I think that the understanding responsibility for AI in terms of control, in terms of meaningful human control, is a very promising weave to incorporate all of the things that the speakers were talking about: the education, inclusivity, privacy, and all the other things. Okay, so this one. Okay, so we all know that human AI socio-technical systems are complex and they are opaque and they're unpredictable, especially the ones with autonomous and semi-autonomous features. And that's why I will say that it's crucial that human agents maintain meaningful control over AI-powered decisions. And this is because we want to prevent responsibility gaps. And I'm going to say a couple of words about responsibility gaps in a couple of seconds. So today, in this very brief presentation, what I will discuss is this idea of responsibility as meaningful human control. I will be looking at what control means and what meaningful means in this weave. This weave is based on a theory, a philosophical traditional theory of individual moral responsibility, but it can extend to legal responsibility and other forms of responsibility as well. So the traditional philosophical debate on moral responsibility basically talks about responsibility as having free will over some of your actions, some of your choices. And in these discussions, the nature and also the existence of very notion of free will is debated. So, people agree that free will is understood mostly as a kind of power to have control over one's actions. So this is where the control idea is coming from when we look at individual moral responsibility. But deciding what kind of control is involved in free will is not very straightforward, and there are so many different theories about that in the philosophical literature. I will just focus on the one that's relevant today, which is basically one contemporary compatibilist idea of moral responsibility and free will. And this compatibilist idea, compatibilist here means that the idea is that free will is responsible, free will and moral responsibility are compatible with determinism, causal determinism. These theories say that free will and moral responsibility require being capable of having rational control over some of the agent's actions. And one branch of this compatibilist idea is focusing on the reason responsiveness idea. So these theories say that the condition for free will and moral responsibility is that a person's decisions are caused by decision-making mechanisms that are responsive to that person's own reasons. Now here, one famous reason responsiveness view of moral responsibility is John Martin Fisher and Mark Rabisa's reasons responsiveness view of moral responsibility. Basically, these philosophers defend the idea that for a person, an agent, to be morally responsible for an action, they should have something called guidance control over that action. So they define control here in terms of guidance, and guidance control means that the person acts according to a decision mechanism that when this person has strong reasons to act, they can acknowledge the reasons for acting or not acting in a wide range of circumstances. So it's responsive to their reasons, the agent's reasons. And the second condition, so this is the reason responsiveness condition. And the second condition is the ownership condition, which basically tells us that the person's decision-making mechanism should be their own, as an indispensable part of who they are, in the sense that these persons, the agents, recognize what they are bringing as effects in the world, and that other people can have reactions toward their actions. So this is the individual. This is about the nature of individual moral responsibility. But when it comes to sociotechnical systems, it's not very straightforward. And sociotechnicals here are defined by the European Commission as systems that consist of 3 types of components. So it includes technologies, human agents, and institutions. So when we delegate some of our decision-making to technologies and institutions, then the responsibility, the question of who is responsible for the untoward outcomes or the desirable outcomes becomes more complicated. And this theory of meaningful human control tries to accomplish diminishing the responsibility gaps. And responsibility gaps can be defined here as the situations where it's unclear who should be held responsible for the actions or outcomes produced by these sociotechnical systems that include institutions, individual agents, and the technologies. So to resolve the gaps in responsibility, here, different kind of responsibility gaps defined by the authors here. So to resolve these the gaps in responsibility, this meaningful human control formalizes and operationalizes the conditions of what we call guidance control. So the ownership condition and the reason responsiveness condition of Fisher and Rabisa's account of individual moral responsibility. So what they say here is, and this is the next slide, the theory proposes 2 conditions for holding individuals responsible for the untoward outcomes. So the first condition is the tracking condition. The tracking condition requires that the human operator's decision-making process tracks or responsive or sensitive to an adequate variety of moral inputs, which means basically the relevant moral reasons of the agents that the agents take to be their own, and the relevant features of the external world. But the tracking here is not mere alignment with the agent's own reasons, but rather it says that the system, AI system or the sociotechnical system, has this capacity to respond to relevant moral reasons in a sufficiently wide variety of possible consequences and adapt to changes in such consequences. So to decide who the relevant human agents are and what the relevant moral reasons of those agents are is another matter. Here, there might be a disagreement about which normative principles or values are correct or to be preferred in this specific situation. And the second condition of meaningful human control is tracing, which is the adaptation of the ownership condition. So the tracing condition says that the system and the capacities of the relevant human agents are aligned, which basically means that we can trace the decisions made by human agents who have a relevant understanding of the system's operation and their role in the operation, and that can take more responsibility for their roles in the operation. So Here, one example could be an airplane's collision avoidance system for split-second emergencies. That can be overridden by pilots. Here, the pilots, when the pilots do their checks before deferring to this system, they rely on the expertise of many other human agents, part of the socio-technical system, including engineers and mechanics. And if they fail to do the checks properly, then they could be held morally responsible. So the responsibility can be traced back to these individuals for the untoward outcomes. I'm not sure how much time I took, but I just want to say why tracking and tracing conditions can be important. So I think they're important because it is necessary to make sure that these systems track the relevant agents' genuine and defensible moral reasons for certain actions by making sure that there are human decision makers who can be held accountable and who can then be incentivized to make the systems work in desirable ways. And also that human decision makers, to make sure that the human decision makers understand how the system works and what their role are in the operation of the system, and they can take more responsibility for their role in the operation of the system. It can also, it may also be necessary to fulfill the tracing and tracking conditions of responsibility to minimize the asymmetries in power when the decision makers and the stakeholders that are affected by their decisions. There's a difference between, there's a power asymmetry between decision makers and those affected by those decisions. I think I took too much time. I just want to say that the theory tries to accommodate these power asymmetries as well. So they kind of enhance the idea of tracking and tracing to include to propose some social preconditions for meaningful human control. If you're curious about that, we can talk about in the Q&A. So this is what I had. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tuba. And now Katrina, over to you.
All right, let me just get myself set up here and slideshow.
We're seeing your slides.
Okay, fantastic, wonderful. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this panel today. I'm really enjoying all of the presentations so far, and I'd love to add to the discussion with a little bit of a walkthrough of a framework that I have developed for how to actually build a responsible AI program. So before I jump into that, maybe I'll situate myself in the context of the bigger work that I do. So I kind of think about my work on two different levels. One level is how do we change the system? And I'm hearing a lot of great conversation around that. How do we bring these big questions to play in the societal kind of version of discussing about responsible AI and what it's all about? But today's talk is going to be more focused on the other type of work I do, which is really about risk mitigation, harm reduction. We're kind of living in this moment. How do we do better? So that's really what this program is all about, or this framework is all about. And it's really jumping off of this question, how can we operationalize responsible AI? And part of that for me is we have these very big principles, these 50,000-foot view principles: be responsible, be ethical, be private. How do we actually take those and drive them into an organization? What does the 50-foot version of these big principles look like? So that was kind of a driving question for me in developing this framework. The other thing that was on my mind is there's lots of these frameworks out there, and you saw one of them a little bit earlier today from the Canadian government. They're fantastic, but they sometimes feel a bit unmanageable. They're very big. And I think about organizations, especially small and mid-sized businesses, a lot of whom are my clients, and it feels really overwhelming when they encounter a 200-page document from NIST, for example, and they're told, go ahead and implement this, build a responsible AI program, and they just don't know where to get started. So that was kind of another criteria for me of how do I make this work actually doable and manageable for organizations. And then the last thing I was really thinking about in terms of my approach to this framework is there's a lot of focus on what I would consider the builders of AI systems. So these are you could talk about big tech, or you could talk about just technology companies in general. And whenever you're building something, you have a lot of ability to look at things like how the blueprints are going to turn out in terms of an AI system. You have a lot of control over the data, the training data, the model, the weightings, all of those kinds of things. But as a buyer, and most of us are going to be in that position of buyer or user of an AI system, we're not building an AI system ourselves from scratch, but we want to be responsible. How do we go forward from that position? So that was kind of the other piece that was really informing this idea of the framework. And so this is where I've landed. It's called the 4 C's, and I'm going to walk you through the framework at a very high level, just in the interest of time. And I'm probably going to spend the most time on the first C, context, and the last C, commitment. And so I'll just kind of walk through this a little bit and give you a flavor for what this is about. So the first C is all about context. And my mental model for that is this idea of mapping the environment. So as an organization, how do we map the environment as it pertains to artificial intelligence? And so I look at this at 2 different levels. One is the external environment. So there's regulations or things we actually need to do to be compliant with, say, data privacy laws. And then there's this idea of what are the social expectations that I need to address with respect to using AI? And that might vary a little bit depending on what domain you're in. But there's kind of this external set of forces that are acting on you as an organization. And then there's the internal things that are happening in your organization. So that might be your values. What are your values and how do they align with bringing this AI system into your organization? Is there a misalignment? How do we feel about that? And I always want to say, saying no is always an option. You don't necessarily have to say yes. And then there's this idea of where is AI in my organization already? Because AI is being infused into all kinds of software products and digital technologies. So it's very likely that it's in your organization in some form. And in order to manage and mitigate risks, you need to really identify where it is. So those are kind of like 2 ways to think about this exercise of mapping the environment. And then there's this piece, which I think is really important. We need to get from those high-level principles, which I do suggest organizations have. They need some kind of an AI ethics statement guided by their values, but they need to make it actionable. And this is really key. Definitely don't commit to things that you're not prepared to do. And I share that with organizations because sometimes it's nice to say, yeah, we're going to do this laundry list of 29 different ethical principles. At the end of the day, though, can you actually deliver on those things? So I think that's really important to do. And then you need to do the hard work of actually making this go from a principle to a policy to something that's actionable. And for that, I want to give you an example. So the example, by the way, I forgot to mention, this whole framework is based on a LinkedIn course. I built a course for LinkedIn about this framework. And in that course, the company that I use as my example is a hotel. So let's say you're running a hotel, you want to bring AI into all your guest rooms. This is going to be so convenient. You're going to have this Alexa-like device in every single room, but you're also really committed to this idea of respecting guests and in particular privacy, so data privacy. What does that actually look like when you try and enact this principle in a really practical, tangible way? And so I'm not going to go through the whole process, but what I want to do is just highlight one thing. Let's say you work in housekeeping. What does this mean for you? What does this responsible AI program look like for you? Well, maybe it looks like you're making sure all those devices are reset to the off position when you're turning over the room between guests. That's super tangible, it's very tactical, and it ties back up to the policy and the principle of respecting guest privacy and data. And that's what I mean in terms of driving this down into your organization. You're going to need to figure out how these principles move from policy to process, procedure. And then, of course, you want to measure this and make sure you're actually doing the things that you say that you are going to do. Culture, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just to kind of touch on this lightly, this is the people piece. And so this work doesn't happen magically. It requires people to do the work. It requires people connecting at the right level. And a lot of this comes down to your governance structures. So what I encourage organizations to do is definitely have an AI ethics committee, which is a multidisciplinary group of people that are going to do the work, but they need to have support from the top. So again, organizations have their own politics and they have their own power dynamics. And what we need to do is try and make sure that this work lives at a high enough level in the organization that it's not optional, that people have to partake in this work and they have to actually be part of the work. So that's kind of the idea of governance structures. Content is a lot of what we've been hearing about, addressing the specific AI risks. And so when I think about the risks, these to me are kind of the big three. We've talked about some of these things already. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but privacy, bias, and explainability, they tend to come up over and over again. They're not everything in terms of all the ethical issues or all the responsible AI issues, but they're the ones that I think organizations really need to pay attention to at a minimum. So they're a good starting place. And part of that is this thing that I call data done right. And it's really thinking through how data is being used throughout the life cycle. Again, as a user, you're not necessarily going to have control of the training data of an AI system, but there's all this other data that's happening as a result of interacting with that system in your organization. And that's the kind of stuff that you do have control over and you need to be thinking about. And part of that is cybersecurity. So these things kind of link back into cybersecurity practices and making sure that, you know, not only are you using the data ethically, but it's also stored securely. I thought it was really interesting listening to Tuba, and we did not coordinate this at all, but her notion of traceability, I think is really, you know, on point, and it's something that I recommend as well, because how do we do all this work? We need to document things, and then we need to have traceability, and that leads to, you know, transparency as well. So I think that's a core component of how the work actually gets done. And then the last C is commitment. And I think this is really important because this is not a one and done. You can't just do the ethics, you know, assessment in the beginning and then go, well, it looks like we're good to go, and then never come back to this again. And so there's this thing called model drift. And I kind of like to think of it like a boat at sea with all the waves impacting it, all the new things that are happening, the data and so forth. And this is a real phenomenon when it comes to AI models. They can actually drift over time and go off course. And so how are you actually monitoring that and making sure that your model is still doing the things that it's supposed to do? And part of that looks like a regular program of assessments and audits. And I just want to draw a slight distinction between these two things. So assessments are really done in the vein of consulting. They're about helping you as an organization to get better. So you can think of somebody going in and they're assessing a bunch of things, and then they give you that report at the end and you get to improve. An audit is really done in the public interest. And it's kind of a pass-fail sort of a thing. And the reality is nobody wants to be audited. Nobody's signing up to be audited. And so this idea of the audit, I think, will need to be part of regulation, especially for the highest risk systems. And I think ultimately these two things are really important to build long-term trust and make sure there's trustworthiness in this whole process. And that's really what this is all about. So we're trying to change a culture. When we think about artificial intelligence coming into our organization, what does it mean to be responsible? I think it's about nurturing this responsible AI culture. And that's through enabling all of these different kinds of practices in our organization, making sure we have the right people doing the work, and then continually being committed to this over the long run. So as I said, this is part of a LinkedIn course. This is a super high level version if you're interested in that. It's called Building a Responsible AI Program, Context, Culture, Content, and Commitment. And I'm on LinkedIn as well if you want to connect with me. But for now, I'll stop sharing and I look forward to the rest of this panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we come to the Q&A section, and thank you. I don't know how I lucked out, but that sequence of 4 small talks really nicely fitted together and nicely sort of showed different perspectives on the issue of responsible AI. Anyway, I'm going to start with a question that came from when people registered. I need to apologize. The question was longer, but I've sort of taken a portion of it. And the question is the following, and I thought maybe I'd start with Bettina here. Given the enormous implications of AI, that the implications could have on our everyday lives, and the retrospective nature of AI in that it necessarily relies on data sets collected in the past. How can we ensure the ethical application of AI, especially for communities that have historically experienced less opportunity? And I think this is especially relevant at this moment when we're thinking about reconciliation and our relationship with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who were here. So maybe Bettina, you want to weigh in on this, and then others might have thoughts too.
Well, thank you for the question. Was just, I hear a very strong echo there. I'll move further away. So I think now it's gone. The problem of learning from the past is a big one. I would just like to sound a note of caution. This is what people do as well. They learn from stuff in the past, and the big difference is not so much which data we learn from, but whether we can transcend that by having values, by having a utopia for a world, a different world we want to live in. And I think that is the non-automatable part that we should be very, very mindful of, and very much make sure that we keep that as a human activity. How should we, or what, given all these things, and given that we can't really get out of AI being AI and people being people, how should we deal with communities, historically disadvantaged communities? The first thing to notice is we should not repeat mistakes that we're doing in other domains, and that is thinking that we know what's best for them. So we need to involve people, and we need to have these thorny discussions about whether we need something in the first place. And if somebody decides, which happens because somebody is in any one power situation on power dynamic, they decide what assumptions they're making and whether these assumptions might be up for revision. So an inclusive environment in which all voices are heard is the first step for that.
Thank you. Wise words. I'm going to ask Florence a question that is, I think, related. Where should ethical responsibility begin? The corporate level, governing bodies, personal, with individual people, or governments? And if it is governments, are our governments, can they keep up? Can they move fast enough? Can they regulate fast enough? Or are there other mechanisms whereby they can keep up with this changing environment?
Thanks for the question, Jeffrey. I'm definitely in favor of multi-stakeholder input, and I think we're getting more into that in recent years. But also, co-regulation is a phrase that I continue to bring up again, because everything needs to happen in concert from the beginning, and as Katrina mentioned, sustained after implementation as well. So really, it's not a one and done. We need to bring in multiple stakeholders from the beginning and continue. So ethics as an afterthought, which has typically been the case in also education, K-12, and university settings. Sometimes in the technical courses or in technical programs, you might get one ethics course that you pinch your nose that people grudgingly take. Now we can and we should deliver ethics education so as to foster broader digital literacy. So this is rather in concert with, to answer your question.
Well, I certainly I appreciate the educational aspect. Since this week, I actually taught the ethics module for all the masters in computing science students. We had a module 2-week, and it's interesting to try to, you know, how does one introduce computer science students at the master's level to ethics? I'm going to change tack here, and because you do philosophy of mind, we've got a great question here. Does the definition of responsible change if people interact with AI as if it was another person?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think it's a great question. So yeah, I think we should focus on as if here. So at the beginning, I wanted to say that I think we are clear on the idea that current AI systems are incapable of doing ethical reasoning themselves, but they're just tools. So basically, they are tools that are given certain purposes to accomplish certain kind of tasks by human beings. So the purpose that we give AI systems kind of affect the results that we are going to get from them. If we, I think the meaning of responsibility would change if we take them, if we interact with them as if they were persons, but in my opinion, so far they're not persons. They're just limited. They're just at the limited level of ethical agency. So in the philosophical artificial moral agency literature, there's this difference between different levels of ethical agencies, where some of the AI systems, they just are evaluated by what kind of outcomes, that undesirable or desirable outcomes that they bring about, but they're not specifically designed to avoid harms or specific, so they're not specifically designed to bring about certain to avoid certain harms, and other ones are specifically designed to avoid certain harms. And these are the kind of AI systems that we have right now. But in the future, hypothetically, if we have certain AI systems who are able to do their ethical reasoning, so they would know what ethical behavior means, and then they can also justify their behavior by their own reasoning, then things would change. But at this point, I would just suggest to focus on the more prominent issues like tracking, tracing the decisions to relevant people's relevant human beings, human agents, relevant reasons, and then tracking to the relevant role in the operation and functioning of the AI systems.
Thank you. A question for you, Katrina. I want to sort of reverse. You've obviously gone into organizations to help them think through how they could operationalize their ethical values. Now I want to sort of put you into the regulator's chair and sort of go, how should we be holding? And so this is, again, it's one of the questions that came from the participants. How should we hold corporations responsible? You know, should we leave it to sort of public relations, just if enough people complain and then it's bad public relations? Or should we be coming to some sort of international agreements about, what we can hold? Should there be, if you will, regulations beyond individual nations of how we're going to hold companies responsible or accountable, and for what things we're going to hold them accountable? So over to you, Katrina.
Yeah, such an interesting and tough question. So there is a international voluntary code that's out there. I think it's being driven by the Center for AI Policy. And I believe the last I saw, there were about 100 companies. I don't know who they are, but 100 companies have signed on for this voluntary code. Of course, that's not regulation. That's just basically saying, hey, I volunteer to abide by these things. And one hopes that organizations might go ahead and do that. When it comes to regulation, I want to pick up on a point. I think it was made by Bettina early on, possibly also by Florence, but governments are in this interesting position where they're kind of navigating the whole, we want to innovate and we want the investment side of things, but we also know our job is to regulate and prevent the worst harms from happening. And so what I see is regulators walking this line, like trying to figure out what that line is. I hear the, don't stifle innovation conversation come up a lot at the same time as we need to do something to mitigate harms. And so everyone's kind of figuring out what that looks like for their nation. And then, of course, we'll need to figure out how to coordinate that. There's also existing regulations that we don't take advantage of. And I think we're starting to see the FTC do a little bit more of this in the United States, especially under the leadership of someone like Lina Khan, who seems really willing to go to bat and put in place things like, what is anti-competitive behavior? Are some of these companies just too big and they have too much data, let's say, and should we break them up? So I think there's some interesting things happening with existing regulation as well as the new regulation. And then the last thing I want to share is that Chief Justice Earl Warren, he has this beautiful quote that says, "The law floats on a sea of ethics." And I think about that all the time because I don't think it's just about regulation. I think regulation's super important and we need it, but I also don't want to lose that ethics thread because I think we also need to kind of bring that into the conversation as well as the regulation.
Thank you. I mean, that's an important point. Bettina.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, absolutely.
I think there is also a much more mundane, but probably ultimately more successful approach, such as the EU is taking. And I'm going to share with you once again the screen because it's so nicely explained in the European AI Act, explained for companies. The AI Act applies to AI systems being placed on the market or being put into service, or general purpose AI models being placed on the market in the EU or European Economic Area, regardless of whether the providers are established or located there or in a third country. In other words, if you want to do business with anyone in the EU, you'd better follow our rules. And that can be an extremely successful approach to regulating also across borders. Of course, you need to have a certain economic standing first. But I'm very curious to see whether the AI Act, the EU's AI Act, will be as successful in this respect as the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, has been. And Katrina, I hope that either you contradict me now or you say that this can be a good compliment, because I really don't believe in self-regulation.
I will add that I think Canada has very deliberately, because Canada doesn't have the clout of the EU or the US or China, Canada, I think, has been very deliberately holding back and trying to align their legislation. C27, similar to the EU Act, is sort of got this sort of ranking of risk, and so things kick in with high risk. And I think that, I think that's also coming from the OECD. It's sort of an emerging consensus of this is one way we can try, and Canada is going to try to align with the EU. If the US comes out with something, then we'll see alignment there. Speaking of sort of politics, we actually have a political scientist who's asking a question on the meeting chat. And it's an important one. Who holds the legitimacy to determine what is responsible behavior in this space? Do governments have the legitimacy, private companies, or people and society? So I'm going to open that up to any of you. Just raise your hand if you want to try and answer. You shouldn't all answer at once. I will go ahead, Bettina. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to circumvent the answer by referring to yet another tech fix. I've recently read a lot more about the Taiwanese experience with these citizen councils. I think the word might be wrong, but Obviously, in theory, if we believe how our countries are being set up, the government should be a representative of the people and should be able to speak on our behalf. Whether we all subscribe to that notion at the moment, I don't know. Companies are people, company representatives are people too, and they also have valid concerns and valid approaches, but the involvement of all and the possibility of let's say contradiction of things that companies or governments believe by citizens should be open. And so we need governance structures and processes to get these different opinions and standpoints together. Katrina, I'm really waiting to hear what you think about this.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to kind of maybe echo that and maybe add on a little bit to this because, you know, I come into these spaces, we have these conversations, and I get the feeling that everyone's looking for the entity, the one big entity. Ideally, it's globally that's going to tell us what to do. It's going to tell us the right way. And I think about the phrase, you know, we are the heroes we've been waiting for. And I think that it's, you know, it's us, right? Like it's society is comprised of us. We elect governments. Sometimes they're more democratic and sometimes not. But I think it really is, and this is hard. This is the hard work of having these conversations, figuring out what that's going to look like. It might not look the exact same in every single place. And I think that's going to be hard too, because while we're trying to align, it's never going to be 100% perfect. And I do not think there is going to be one global entity that is going to have that legitimacy across the world and say, this is exactly how it's going to be. I think it really needs to be this much tougher bottoms up type approach.
And I note on that we're seeing different levels of government. We always seem to sort of assume that it has to be one international or national. But, you know, the city of San Francisco has, you know, introduced regulations about face recognition and so on like that. We could actually see governments at all different levels getting into conflict about this. California legislating. Trump gets elected and sort of, you know, the Congress introduces legislation that undermines the legislation coming from California. Florence, do you have thoughts? I brought it to the American election, and you're on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, I think in Canada we tend to think a little more, a lot more federally because of the way that power is distributed. But in the U.S., for example, my home state is Illinois, and we have very strong biometric protections. And so, you know, when it comes to one's control over biometric data, there is a lot more power that the everyday user has than in, say, the states that border Illinois. And you might really see this in stark contrast if you are doing a road trip and you have a mobile phone, and you can see what switches off at the state line, right? And so this is really speaking to some of the in-betweens and just within the same country, being able to come to not only consensus over guidelines and policy, but on a really hard law. Absolutely, this is the struggle of the here and now, and to get to the point of legitimacy, I mean, who is regarded as legitimate? Often the best thing we have is who is democratically elected to look out for the public good. And certainly the power in big tech is disproportionately skewed to the large companies, so that the smaller actors, who are typically the companies who would look to Katrina for help, you know, they're kind of left wondering what to do. So this is part and parcel with the global struggle, really.
Okay, we have another interesting question from our online participants here, and And the question is about how can we incentivize corporations to adopt responsible AI practices? And does someone want to think about incentives? Does somebody want to think about how we can, I know Katrina, you've got experience working with companies, but you're working with companies who presumably invite you in, so they're already incentivized. Thoughts? Oh, Bettina, thank you. Take it.
I would prefer to hear Katrina first, but only
Okay.
short.
Yeah, so I guess, incentives, there are different kinds. So just kind of maybe basic carrot and stick, right? So we're talking about regulation, we're talking about the stick. So what are the fines that are going to happen? Are you going to get sued? I always tell the story of Rite Aid, the American drugstore chain. So this is the FTC doing some good work, taking Rite Aid to court and saying, hey, the way you deployed facial recognition software is really problematic. And guess what? You're on the hook for that. And there's going to be some restrictions. And now they've got a 5-year ban. They can't use that technology. That's the stick. The carrot for me, it's a little bit harder because I don't think there's necessarily we're going to pay you to do the right thing. But the conversations that I tend to have are, do you want to be like the Patagonia of responsible AI? Do you want to be that brand that's doing the right thing? Do you want to be the fair trade coffee version of this? And that does have resonance with people. And there is a market for that. There's a market for these kinds of things. And so the more that we as consumers demand those things, the more of a market we're going to have for those things. And so that's why I think all of us have a role in this. So how do we get to that fair trade coffee version or that Patagonia version? And I think that's a conversation that, I love having that conversation with companies to try and push them and nudge them in that direction.
So now, Bettina, you can talk.
Exactly as I expected. That was the best introduction. I completely agree with you, Katrina. I think I want to add a thing that may be mundane and boring, but I think it's really important for companies is to have standards and certificates. It's a very double-edged sword. I mean, lots gets lost if you replace general and adaptable guidelines by checklists, essentially. But on the other hand, many companies want and need this kind of certainty, this legal certainty of if we follow that process, if we get that certification, then we're on the right side of the ethics divide, let's say. And I think we should really, as academics, as consultants, welcome this and shape it and see to it that standardization bodies are being composed of a wide range of positions, that civil society is integrated in the right way, but that at the end of the day, there is the certainty, this is how you can do it, and this is how you're going to be in the right, how you're going to go in the right direction.
So I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator and add a bit of an answer of my own, and then call that the last word because we've gotten to the end of the hour. But one of the things I've noticed is that because I've been working with some startups and people is many startups are dependent on funding coming from different sources, whether it's from government funds or then venture capital funds. In fact, a big part of the startup process in this space is a sort of stepped leveraging of funding as you go from a concept. And I think the funders can insist on ethics. In fact, it's to their advantage, and they can also insist on some level of auditing, and that gets inherited. The second point I want to make is, where am I going with this? Is the individuals. I think this gets back to the question of education. The one particular startup that I've been talking to that's working in the environmental space, it's the individuals who come incentivized, and I think they've come incentivized because they've come out of an educational system, where they've come to care for certain things, which is why they even chose to do a certain type of project. Now, we do actually have a question from the students. Thank you here. So if some of you are willing to stay an extra minute or so, in an AI-driven political future, will there be meaningful interaction between AI and democracy? What happens to democracy if in this imagined future? And how will deep fakes and AI-generated information and misinformation affect this democratic future? So that's a really nice, big, juicy question that I think we can all dig our teeth into as a sort of closing thought. Florence, do you have some thoughts on this?
I have many, but the short answer I'll provide now is in line with looking at marginalized communities and how we still don't have ways to talk about silence and the role of silence as signal, because we've been really too occupied with looking at signal in terms of the affirmative, right? Binary, on, off, yes, no. And so if we continue to enable machines to make decisions for us, if we are delegating our decision-making power to machines, increasingly so in the process of automation, we are giving over that ability to judge ambiguity and the uneasiness that is non-binary thinking in our human existence. So really, it goes back to, for me anyway, an existential humanistic question where we're looking at the tension between the digitalization, datafication, and how we want to imagine our future democratically otherwise.
Thank you. Tuba, do you have some thoughts about, so you talked about meaningful human control, some thoughts about maybe democratic control or loss of control as we automate more tasks and functions?
I do actually. I think this is a great question, a very big question, but I was just thinking about the stuff that I couldn't get into in the brief presentation. But actually this meaningful human control theory does reformulate the tracking and tracing conditions in order to include the social dimensions as well. So I just wanted to kind of iterate that. So basically the reformulation of the tracking condition here is this idea that socio-technical systems that include AI should track reasons that are not formed through social processes strongly influenced by unjust social hierarchies. So then we would be asking more questions about where the decisions are being, in what kind of context the decisions are being made. And then the theory also says the tracing social precondition for meaningful human control is that having relevant psychological capacities that can be both technical or moral, they're insufficient for moral responsibility, but they're insufficient for moral responsibility for the behavior of socio-technical systems, but people should not be encumbered by their social identities as moral agents. So the kind of social dimension of meaningful human control does already try to kind of include all the relevant stakeholders by trying to ensure that the decisions made through the mediation of technologies are not made in this context of unjust social hierarchies, or the human agents who are part of the socio-technical systems are not encumbered by their social identities. So perhaps that could be one way to look at it.
So I think that's a perfect place to end. I want to thank all of our presenters for a fabulous, I was going to say triangulation, but it was 4 presenters, or quadrilation or something like that. And you really nicely complemented each other with different perspectives. I want to thank participants for great questions, and then the students here for questions too, and for inviting this panel into your class. And of course, Nico, who has done a lot of the technical work, and the others at the AI for IA. Remind you that there's this great drop-in conference. You're sitting around Saturday bored, you can go on to GatherTown and responsible AI as a 1980s video game. Okay, what could be better? Thank you very much, everyone.